Okay, so I am now going to review Take 5.3K, which is add and subtract positive rational numbers fluently. And if you remember, a positive rational number is one that can be written as a fraction and a decimal. And so so here were some important points that we talked about that you need to know. So you need to remember the fraction and decimal equivalents for these. And so remember, we thought about these like money, like quarters. And so if you have 25 hundredths, 25 cents, that's the equivalent of 1 out of 4 quarters. You have 50 cents, 50 hundredths, you have 2 out of 4 quarters. And we know that 2 fourths is equivalent to half. And you have 7,500 hundredths, you have 3 out of 4 quarters. So those would be some important fraction decimal equivalents to memorize and to know. And then also, you already knew this, like if we have 3/10, obviously the fractional equivalent of that is just 3 over 10. And then that would be the same thing as 30 hundredths would be equivalent also to 3/10. So, so we have 30 hundredths, you can write it like 30 hundredths, but that's also equivalent, same thing as 3/10. And also a lot of you had already realized the fraction decimal equivalent for fifths. It counts by 20s, and so a lot of y'all already had figured that out this year. So like 1/5 is equivalent to 2/10 or 20 hundredths. 2/5 is equivalent to 4/10 or 40 hundredths. 3/5 is equivalent to 6/10 or 60 hundredths, and 4/5 is equivalent to 8/10 or 80 hundredths. So when we look at a problem like number 17, 5/8, find the sum. First of all, what does sum mean? To add. And so when we look at a problem like this, we have a fraction and we have a decimal. We talked about there are multiple ways to work the problem. These problems don't have answer choices, and so we're not trying to make it a decimal or a fraction. You can just kind of do what's easiest for you. So I think I'm going to leave the fraction as 5/8 and turn the 25 hundredths into a fraction. So if you remember what we just wrote over here, I know that 25 hundredths is equivalent to 1/4. So now I just have a fraction plus a fraction. So 5/8 plus 1/4. Well, I can't add 5/8 and 1/4 because they don't have common denominators. So you have to ask yourself, what is the least common denominator between 8 and 4? And it is 8. And so when I turn my fourth into 8, that's times 2, that is 2 eighths. And so now my problem becomes very simple. 5/8 plus 2 eighths equals 7/8. All right, and so we look at this one over here, number 18. Now we're going to subtract 1 3/10 and 1 7/5 hundredths. So on this particular problem, I think I am going to turn the fraction into a decimal. So 1 3/10 as a decimal will just be 1 3/10. I have to find the difference, I have to subtract. So obviously when I subtract, the larger number has to go on top. So I don't put 1 3/10 on top, I have to put 1 7/5 hundredths on top. So whenever I subtract decimals, I have to line my decimals up. So that'll be 1 3/10. I can add a 0 here because that's the same thing. And then I will subtract. 5 minus 0 is 5. 7 minus 3 is 4. And I'll bring my decimal down, and that will be a 0. And so my final answer there would be 45 hundredths. And if I wanted to write that as a fraction, I could be the same thing to write 45 over 100. And I could either write it as a fraction or write it as a decimal. And remember, there's really no right or wrong way to work these problems as far as, do you want your answer to be in fraction form? Do you want your answer to be in decimal form? Because every decimal has an equivalent fraction and every fraction has an equivalent decimal. The only reason why you would have to do it one way or the other is if you had answer choices and your answer choices were all fractions or your answer choices were all decimals, and then obviously your answer would have to be either the fraction or the decimal, but there is an equivalent for each one, so you can write each one both ways.